24 hours to call me Dr. Sean Landsman, and we're getting rid of doctor. But for today, anyway, I guess I can call myself a doctor, so which is nice. It was a lot of work. And actually, part of what we hit some of the lights here, maybe the one up front. Some of actually what I talked about yesterday in the public presentation portion of my dissertation defense was data that I gathered right up here at Rapids Pond. So I don't have any of that in this presentation today, but if you guys want to talk to me a little more about that at the end of my presentation, definitely ask. So the talk I have planned today is really just a crash course in migratory fishes that we have here in this region. I've tried to keep it focused on mostly species we would see here in PEI, with some additional interesting ones thrown in as well. Okay, so we've got to get some terminology out of the way first so that we're all on the same page. But fish migration can actually take several forms. So we have some fish like the bluefin tuna that migrate solely within saltwater. And then we have other species that migrate solely within freshwater. And then we have some species that actually move between environments. And we call those types of species diagenous species. The life history strategy of the migratory species that we're probably most familiar with we call anadromous, the anadromous species. And this is a type of diagenous species. And so it's characterized by birth in freshwater with an outmigration as juveniles into the ocean for an adult growth phase and then return back to freshwater to spawn. Now, the catagenous species, which I took that slide out of the presentation just to save a little bit of time, but catageny, which is best exemplified by American eels, is just the reverse of that. So they would be born somewhere out in the ocean. In the case of American eels, they're born in the Sargasso Sea, and then they actually come back in to freshwater, where they spend upwards of, for eels, 20 to 30 years growing into adults, and then they'll return back to the ocean to breed. And so this is just to give you some background in terms of when these different anadromous species tend to spawn. And as you can see here, we pretty much start with rainbow smelt around this time. Are there smelt down at the river? Does anyone know if there's smelt down here yet? Yeah. There are, yeah. So I think there's smelt in just about every coastal river and little tributary currently. So they would have come in about 2 weeks ago or so. So we start usually with rainbow smelt in early, mid-April, and then most of the species will finish up sometime in July or maybe August, as the case is with Atlantic sturgeon. The one exception, of course, being Atlantic salmon there that tend to come in the fall, sometime in October or November. Okay, so the American eel, we'll get it started with one of these diagenous species. It's the only catagenous species that I'll talk about. I just mentioned a little bit about their life history strategy. You can see that this area here, the Sargasso Sea, so here we are. So the eels in PEI eventually will out-migrate, so they'll go past Cape Breton and they'll come down somewhere into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, which has been designated as the Sargasso Sea, and they'll come out here and breed. Now, these things have a very complex life history strategy involving multiple stages of development. You have a larval drift stage, so this stage right here is called the leptocephalus stage, and that is really referring to a willow leaf shape that the juveniles take on as they begin drifting in the open ocean. Does anyone have any thoughts as to why they would take that shape, the shape of a willow leaf in the middle of the ocean like that? Any guesses?
Ride the current.
Ride the current, yeah. So if you took a willow leaf, you threw it in the air, what does it do? It gets blown in the wind, right? So the wide surface area of that leptocephalus stage gets easily carried in the currents, and depending on where they're actually born in the sea here, they may end up going over to Europe, they may end up going down here, or they may end up going into the eastern seaboard of North America. Now, they're technically classified as endangered. Now, if any of you, does anyone in here fish eels? Okay, so if anyone knows an eel fisherman, they'll probably tell you that we don't have any shortage of eels here. And most of the population information about American eels does seem to indicate that actually PEI and Atlantic Canada is one of the strongholds for American eels. It's when you start getting inland, say in Ontario, the Ottawa River. In the Ottawa River, the American eel used to be the most abundant species of fish in that river system. Today, it's channel catfish. But at one point, it used to be American eels. However, with the installation of these huge hydroelectric dams, it's essentially wiped out most of their adult growth habitat, just prevents them from getting upstream, or they get caught within the dam turbines themselves and are chopped up into little bits of eel sushi. They're one of the only two semal-pair species in the region, meaning when they eventually do spawn, they end up dying. So when they come out to the Sargasso Sea, they don't come back and re-enter our rivers anymore. They go out to the sea, spawn, and then they die. I'll talk about another one of those species in a little bit. So here's a little bit more, some more developmental it's just a diagram there of the leptocephalus stage. You can see it beginning to metamorphose into this glass eel stage. So this is essentially around the time that they're born. Shortly after they're born, then they're drifting middle of the ocean. They're getting closer and closer to the coast until we get the glass eel stage. And this is what those little glass eels look like. So currently in Nova Scotia, southwestern Nova Scotia, down south of Halifax, that area there, there's currently a glass eel run occurring. So there's fishermen out there currently catching those little eels, which 1 kilogram of those guys can fetch upwards of $1,000. So very, very lucrative fishery. Those usually either get shipped off to somewhere in Asia and eaten just like that, or shipped to American eel aquaculture facilities, and they'll grow those up into adults. Now, as I mentioned earlier, PEI eels are a little bit special in the fact that they are that this is a stronghold for the species, but also because most or a lot of the research that's come out of PEI, in particular by David Cairns, who some of you may know. He's with DFO. And David has actually done some movement analysis. He's actually found that instead of these eels spending a lot of time in freshwater, they kind of seem to do a little something that's a little bit different from other populations in North America, which is they essentially just stay in the estuaries for a while. Hence why we have such a good adult fishery here. They just hang out in the estuaries. They may not ever even go into freshwater. Just sort of sets conventional thinking on top of its head. So this was a shot right below right at Trappy Beach there, right below where everyone likes to go swim. And that was somewhere else within Trappy Bay as well. Now, eels have a very unique swimming action. Let's see if I can pull up a short video here. So you'll see that they actually swim very differently than other fish species do. So instead of just using sort of the back end of their tail, they actually use the entirety of their body. Yeah, sorry. I have to mute the I was naming this. So they actually use the whole of their body, and it's really actually not a very energetically efficient form of swimming, but I can tell you from personal experience being under the water with these guys that when they want to move, they can move. They can actually burst very quickly away. Now, most of the time, they just tend to spend most of their time foraging on the bottom. They just essentially dig around in the muck until they come across something. Now, they're often looking for little crustaceans or other invertebrates, and will sometimes eat dead animals as well, dead fish or dead crustaceans. Now, Atlantic salmon, they probably in this room don't need any introduction in this region. This is an image of a large female that was captured in a trap in North Lake Creek from this past fall. It's a nice fish. And this here is a smolt. And so you can see the smolt has lost more of those characteristic, what we call par marks. Those are the stripes. And that's pretty characteristic of this life stage. When they're the juveniles and they're living within the freshwater systems, in the early stages of their lives, they have those par marks, and then eventually they lose those, silver up, and when you start to, if you were ever to catch one of these, and they look like that, it's essentially imminent that that fish will head right out to the ocean. And then eventually, for our fish, they go through the Strait of Belle Isle, most of them through the Strait of Belle Isle, and then up towards Greenland to go and forage. A few years ago, there was a very important study for PEI salmon, and that essentially showed that PEI salmon have a very unique genetic strain. So this little, don't worry about, just look at all the pretty colors, and essentially what all those pretty colors are telling you is that there's different groupings, different genetic groupings here. And then we have Considered Island. We have, I think that was North Lake Creek and Cross River, I think. And they essentially did this genetic analysis and found that PEI salmon are genetically distinct from other salmon within the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So this light green blob here, all those lines within that light green area are a bunch of different systems that feed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, including the Miramichi, I think the Restigouche, and there's some other very famous systems. And here's PEI all the way up here. So there's something very interesting going on with the genetics of our salmon here. In some cases, we do have, so somewhere within there is the Morel River that's been lumped in with the rest of the Gulf of St. Lawrence and look very similar to the Miramichi because we tend to stock early run Miramichi strain fish into that river, and I think some other rivers of PEI as well. And here's just a brief look at their life cycle here. So they begin as eggs, of course. The elven or then the yolk sac fry here. They eventually develop into the fry stage, so they'll begin to use up more and more of that egg sac there, which contains lots of nice lipids and fatty acids. Eventually they'll deplete all that, and then they'll turn into the par stage, which is when they begin feeding exogenously. So they'll begin feeding on little bugs at that point. So they stay within the freshwaters for about 2 to 4 years before they then begin the smoltification process, which is kind of an intermediate stage here. It's when they start to lose their nice stripy markings there and then turn into the silvery smolt, and then they'll head out in the ocean for, in some cases, they'll head into the ocean for just one overwintering period, then they come back into freshwater, and so we know those as the grills. If they stay out for more than one winter, we call those multi-sea winter fish, and those are your big ones. Those are the ones that everyone wants to catch. Once they finish spawning, the conventional wisdom is that they tend to come down somewhere into the lower reaches of the rivers. We term those kelp. There's other black salmon, I think, is another one that's used in this region as well. Now here in PEI, because our rivers are so short, because our province is fairly small, it's likely that a lot of those fish, after they spawn, they just head back out in the ocean and then continue to forage out there. But in some of the larger river systems in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, they would hang out towards the bottom of those rivers before actually leaving in the spring to feed again. Now the little par, when they're in the very fast-flowing rivers, they can actually do something that's quite interesting in order to allow them to live within the environments like they would be in the freshwater rivers. So par, if you've ever laid a fly along a riffle somewhere in a river with salmon, you might have caught an Atlantic salmon par, and they tend to like those faster flowing riffly habitats. Now, they can actually hold themselves within the current just essentially by pushing their bodies flat on the river bottom. And one of the distinguishing characteristics of an Atlantic salmon par versus a smaller brook trout are those huge airplane-like wings, those large pectoral fins that come off the front of them. They can actually use those like hydrofoils, tip them just a little bit, and then lower their bodies a bit, and then the current actually pins the fins to the bottom. They can hold really well in fast currents, so that gives them a little bit of an adaptation there to live in those environments, whereas brook trout don't have that. Their fins are much smaller, so they tend to be confined to pools and rivers. Here's just another interesting little shot there of some research that was occurring up in North Lake Creek. And as I mentioned earlier, part of what this study found is that the smolts that were tagged with these little acoustic transmitters, you can see Scott's inserting one into the body cavity of that smolt there. These fish basically just go out of North Lake Creek, and then they head pretty much straight up towards the Strait of Belle Isle here, and then hang a left and go north up towards the feeding grounds in Greenland. Fortunately, there's an open commercial fishery in Greenland, so a lot of them do get caught eventually as adults in that commercial fishery. But if some of them are lucky, they will come back and return to PEI and North Lake Creek to spawn. They have a really well-defined ability to home back to the river that they were born in. Okay, sturgeon. Now, I don't know of very many anglers that have ever caught an Atlantic sturgeon in PEI rivers or in the estuary areas of PEI rivers. But at one point, they did exist here. Today, they tend to be confined to some of the larger systems in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. You can find them all over the place in the Bay of Fundy. You can find them up the St. John River as well. In Atlantic Canada, we have two species. We have the short-nosed sturgeon and the much larger Atlantic sturgeon. And these guys, I think the world record, my buddy said he just broke it the other day. It's about 30 pounds, 31 pounds or so from the St. John River. This here is a white sturgeon caught in the Fraser River in British Columbia. So we don't have these guys on our coast. Those Atlantic sturgeon don't get quite that big. And then this is a gigantic, these are beluga sturgeon from Russia. You can see just how long that is given the number of guys there. Even this little one down here is probably just as big as that one there, so you can get a sense of scale there. These are generally some of the most imperiled fish species on Earth. Freshwater fish species. They have I think about 25 species of sturgeon, and nearly all of them are either threatened or endangered. They can grow really, really large. Again, you have these gigantic beluga sturgeon or the white sturgeon. But out here on the East Coast, I won't talk about the short-nosed sturgeon, but I will talk a little bit about the Atlantic sturgeon here in just a second. A few of the distinguishing characteristics of sturgeon are this really ugly face. They have this that's called an inferior mouth, so it's on the lower part of the jaw, and they basically just go along the bottom, as that might suggest, forming function. They just suck stuff up off the bottom. Crustaceans and vertebrates, lots of dead stuff. They're just kind of going down and acting as bottom dwellers. I think the next slide, there's a picture of a sturgeon. You can see its eye. Its eye is very small relative to its head because they tend to live in dirty, dark environments, so they don't really need to use their vision all that well. But these barbels allow them to, they have olfactory bulbs on them, and so they can actually smell things and detect scent that way. If you look really closely, there's these little kind of gray, circle-ish looking things here, kind of irregular shaped circle things. Those are electrosensitive pores. So they act a lot like a shark's sixth sense, where they can detect very slight electrical signals. So those would be things that would be moving around on the bottom. Even just a heartbeat of a fish sends out a tiny little electrical pulse that these electrosensitive pores can detect. They also are characterized by having these scutes on the top. So one thing about sturgeon is they're extremely evolutionarily old. Really, really old. They're some of the oldest fish species out there. Their scutes are a lot like these, this scoot from an alligator. So I'll let you pass that around. It's basically just a bony plate that used to function to help protect the fish and some other evolutionarily similar species. Okay, so here you can see that small eye relative to that sturgeon. Now, to give you a sense of scale here, there's a hand there coming in. We released that fish that was caught in the net. That fish is about 8.5 feet long and was probably about 300 pounds. But they can get up to 15 feet and 800 pounds. Now, one that size hasn't been caught in a very long time. But there used to be a very active commercial fishery in the St. John River, and you used to be able to catch them upwards of that size. They can live very old. They can get to about 60 years of age, so they can live a long time. Some sturgeon species can be well over 100 years old by the time they die. There is a small commercial fishery currently in the St. John River. Has anyone had any of this Acadian sturgeon caviar? Has anyone had this? Sometimes you can find it at the farmer's market in Charlottetown. But there's a gentleman out there who runs a relatively small commercial fishery for these. That was actually how I was able to get this photo. He had just caught that fish, and he was doing some research in partnership with DFO, so we let that one go. We let all of them go that day, actually. But he will go out and he will harvest eggs from some of these individuals, and then he takes the rest of the body and uses it to smoke sturgeon meat and do a lot of things with it. Striped bass. Does anyone fish for striped bass in here? Yeah. Catch them? Do you have any luck here? No PEI?
No.
Do you go over to here or she?
Yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I don't really bother with them here. But you can catch them, and there are guys that catch them in the Pisgah River. They catch them in a number of different river systems here. But the population of the Miramichi River has exploded. There's really no other adjective to use other than there's just been a huge explosion of fish that's occurred there. In the early 90s, the population of the number of spawners was only 3,000 to 5,000, but then that skyrocketed to about 318,000 at the last official estimate. So this is likely as a result of a harvest moratorium that was put in place once the population reached that level. DFO said no one's going to touch these for a while, and we've seen this huge resurgence in their numbers, so quite substantial. Now, striped bass have quite a varied diet. They will eat just about anything they can get their mouths on, from crustaceans and crabs, that sort of thing, to smelts and tomcod, and if they can access capelin, they can eat capelin. They will often eat eels as well, so in New England, one of the popular ways of fishing for these things is to actually go out and buy some eels, some fresh eels, and put them on a hook and use them that way. Large bloodworms too as well. However, there is a concern in the Miramichi River, and perhaps rightly so, as some recent evidence is starting to suggest, that striped bass may be consuming some of the Atlantic salmon smolts in that river system. There's not a lot of evidence to support that, but there is some, and there's enough. They've generated enough of a predation figure. So there's been upwards of, I think, about 15% of smolts in any given year could be eaten by striped bass. So that is a little bit concerning there. This is a shot at Enfield. There's Enfield, Nova Scotia. There's a river that comes out of Grand Lake where they will aggregate around this time of year, actually. I think it was about the 29th of April last year when I took that photo. White perch, they're a little bit of a different story here. They're not necessarily obligated to go into freshwater to breed. They can go in sort of if they want to, if they feel like going in, or maybe the spawning habitat downstream has been taken up by someone else, they'll come into freshwater. They can come up into freshwater fairly far. There's been some ponds on PEI that are a decent distance above the head of tide that have been colonized by white perch. So they can form these landlocked populations. If anyone's ever handled these things, they can actually be quite difficult and dangerous to handle. They have, in addition to these spines, this one's laid its dorsal spines down here, but they have this very, very sharp gill plate. So if you ever run across one of these, just be cautious when you go to handle it, because the gill plate there is like a razor blade. You'll cut yourself not even know it and look down and you're just bleeding like a stuck pig. I speak from experience there. Okay, probably my favorite fish species in all of Atlantic Canada, and it might be the only person that says this, because those things are darn ugly, but it's a sea lamprey. And the sea lamprey is, I think, one of the coolest species in existence, in part because it's one of the very few parasitic species. So these species that will feed off of a host fish or other organisms, and they've actually been spotted on marine mammals as well. So they're extremely primitive. That's another interesting thing about them. They date back way before any of the salmon species, trout species that we're familiar with. They actually don't have a true backbone. They have what's called a notochord, so they actually predate our modern vertebrates. They also have no jaw. They're actually of a class of species called Agnatha, which means a jawless fish. And so here's what their jaw, quote unquote, looks like. They don't have a jaw again. They just have these rasping teeth here, and then a rasping tongue there that they use to bore into the host fish. Then they can secrete an anticoagulant out of their body to help prevent clotting of the blood as they begin pulling body fluids out of the host fish that they feed on. It's quite disgusting. In the Great Lakes, so I'm originally from Chicago, in that area, and they are an invasive species, a very bad invasive species in the Great Lakes. They have been fingered as one of the primary factors that caused the collapse of the lake trout fishery in Lake Michigan and a number of other of the Great Lakes as well. Now out here, they're a natural part of the assemblage. I try and tell folks, if you do run across one of these, yes, they are ugly, yes, they might attach themselves and suck the blood of maybe your favorite trout species, but try not to kill it. They are a natural part here. If I was giving this talk in Chicago, I'd say kill every one of them that you see. But out here, these things have every right to be left alone in their habitats here. And they're, again, at the second, 2 of 2 several pair of species that we have in this region. Meaning when they come back into the rivers like we have here to spawn, they die. Now, I have a very interesting video because in addition to their ability to use their suction cup mouth to feed, you can actually use it for a totally different purpose as well. Give it a second. So this is what their nests look like. They build nests just like a salmon or a trout will in the fall, except they're doing it in the spring. You'll see just in just a second just how they create that depression in the substrate there. Watch that rock. Oh, wrong rock. So when they do come back into fresh water and end up dying, so any of the nutrients that they've gathered at sea, they're able to bring into the freshwater ecosystems, and then when they die, they deliver all of those nutrients gathered at sea. There we go. Wow, they grab the rock. So you can see that they're using that, instead of using their tail, it's not a very broad tail, right? It's actually quite small. So they don't actually sweep the gravel like trout and salmon do. They use that suction cup mouth to grip onto rocks and then yank them downstream. And some of these rocks probably weigh as much or close to as much as those adults themselves do. That was a pretty big rock we just moved there. So as soon as they take their tail, and you'll see this in a second, it's not the most efficient method of digging. As you can see, it's not really moving a whole lot of those larger stones, but it will get rid of some of the finer gravel. But when they shake their bodies like that, they can dislodge little insects, and so sometimes you actually see brook trout and other fish species just downstream of the nest, and they're just sitting there waiting to grab the insects that have been dislodged. And then just by moving all of those rocks and creating that depression in the bottom, they effectively act as little ecosystem engineers, and so they can create additional habitat that might not otherwise be available prior to their activities. Okay, so Gaspereaux, we know them locally in this region as Gaspereaux. If I was giving this presentation in, say, Maryland, they would have no idea what I was talking about there. They call it river herring. But Gaspereaux is really a term to describe two very closely related species that look almost identical. Does anyone know which is which here? Any guesses? One is the alewife and one is the blueback. They look pretty identical, right? So this one's the alewife and that's the blueback herring. The way you tell them apart, very difficult if I didn't have this little flap of skin open there. But you can see that the inside of the body cavity is white in the alewives and is dark black. That's not blood there. That's actually the color of their intraperitoneal cavity. So the lining of their body cavity is very black. Now, if you step back and kind of look a little bit, you can start to see some differences between them. The eye tends to be a little bit bigger in the alewives and smaller in the blueback herring. There's slight differences in color, but a little bit of different coloration in the head, but those are quite subjective. So if you get the chance to, if you have a knife on you and there's some dead herring on the ground, and you don't mind taking your knife and getting them a little bit dirty, you can see what's what there just by looking at the inside of their body cavities. Now, alewives need to spawn in ponds. We have alewives in the Wheatley River here that come in. They'd probably be coming in June-ish. And so they'll try and get into Raccoon's Pond there, and that's pretty much the end of the line for them. They'll just get into the pond, they won't go any farther. They want that pond habitat, they'll spawn there, and then they'll eventually turn and go back out to sea. Now, blueback herring will also spawn within the river. So the West River has a very strong run of blueback herring. You can find them usually splashing around in June and July down in the lower portions and the saltwater portions of the West River. It's also been estimated that these things can contribute as many marine-derived nutrients as salmon on the West Coast can, as many or more in some cases. So the amount of nutrients that they're bringing into freshwater ecosystems when they move from the ocean into freshwater to spawn can be really, really substantial. In some cases in New England, they actually have to limit the number of these things that come into freshwater because those systems are already so nutrient saturated that you add a little bit of phosphorus and you create these huge algal blooms, and that's not a good thing. It can be with marine algae, which is toxic. So in some cases, they actually end up limiting the numbers that come into freshwater. Now, aside from the sea lamprey, I have a special affinity for rainbow smelt because this is what I did most of my dissertation on. Before I got here, or just when I got here, everyone just kind of shirked off these things. It's, little rainbow smelt cares about these things. They don't swim very well, they don't swim very far upstream. But actually, in my studies, I found that these things can swim a decent distance upstream above the head of tide. They're very, very stubborn. I've seen bodies of rainbow smelt that have been bitten in half by a raccoon, and the little guy's still trying to swim upstream. So quite remarkable. They actually can smell faintly like cucumbers. Has anyone actually smelled one before? And can anyone else verify this? I didn't know this until last year. Someone came by my study site one day and said, you should smell one of those things. They actually smell a little bit like cucumber. I said, no, come on. Stop pulling my leg. And next one I grabbed, I picked up, and I smelled it. It actually does smell a little bit like cucumber. So the next time you go and get a smell feed, smell one of those fish and see for yourself. So they're spring spawning. Again, they come in right now. Their nutrients are incorporated by a wide variety of stream organisms. So one of my research projects that I did for my dissertation looked at the different things within the freshwater river systems here on PEI that can use rainbow smelt nutrients when they bring them in. So we see everything from predatory insects like larger predatory caddisflies and brook trout to then I set up a camera trap and took several pictures of raccoons. Barn cats eat them. Mink will also eat them as well. Of course, you have your herons and ospreys and eagles, and even ravens and crows will pick them off too from the water's edge. There's a little yellow dot right there. I did get an image of a song sparrow that was perched right next to those eggs, and it actually seemed like it might have been eating them, but also could have just been looking at the smelt that were in the water right below it. And in summary, we have several species of anadromous and migratory fishes on the East Coast, ranging from those small rainbow smelt that only get to be about 12 inches long to the huge sturgeon that can be upwards of 10 feet or more. We have some really weird ones like the sea lamprey, as I described, that parasitic species, and we also have those American eels, which can actually go out and breed in the ocean and then come back, and then the young come into our freshwater systems to grow into adults. And we know from several studies, including one of my own and others in the region, that all of these species can contribute substantial nutrients into our freshwater ecosystem. So when we think about the need to build fish passage structures like that run around bypass channel at Rapids Pond, or like a true fish ladder or pool and weir fishway, we should be thinking about building those structures not only to allow those fish to get upstream and spawn and complete their life cycles, but also to make sure that we can get some of those really important nutrients that they bring with them from the ocean and deliver them into fresh water. Because a lot of those nutrients, particularly things like fatty acids, does anyone take omega-3 fatty acids in here as a supplement? I just started doing that myself, in part because a lot of the stuff I've been reading says there's lots of health benefits associated with that. And so we know that organisms that will consume marine-derived nutrients will also consume the marine omega-3 fatty acids that are brought in by these species, usually within the eggs of these species. And so there's a number of potential health benefits associated with that. So very important that we not only get fish upstream to spawn, but also to deliver those nutrients. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to field them now. I actually have, what time is it? It's about 30 minutes. What did I say? We said 45 minutes or so. I have another video. I was going to talk a little bit about, I'll talk a little bit about it right now, in fact, here. I wasn't sure how long this would be, because I've actually given this talk before, but it was for an hour and a half slot, so it's quite a bit longer. I'll unhide this one. We'll just talk a little bit briefly about brook trout, because it's worth, if we're going to talk about Atlantic salmon, we might as well mention brook trout. And brook trout are actually another partially diadromous species. So a lot of the trout within our rivers do remain stream resident. So this one here is probably a stream resident, bigger one, but a stream resident on that board there. This is a classic sized stream resident brook trout. They don't get all that big, say, 10 or 12 inches or something like that. I'm just kind of pulling a number out of thin air there. But then you get these ones. These aren't stream resident. There's not enough food to support fish that big if it were to spend its entire life within our river systems. Although we do have a lot of food here. But this individual would have gone out to sea when it was a juvenile. So there's part of the population that is stream resident and part of the brook trout populations in PEI and in Atlantic Canada that do go out to sea. So they can get quite large here. So brook trout actually is like a little dinner party factoid you can impress your friends with. Brook trout aren't actually a true trout species. So it's actually more accurate to cross that out and replace it with char. So brook trout are actually more closely related to Arctic char. Their genus is called Salvelinus. Most trout species are Oncorhynchus. So they're a completely different genus, more closely related to Arctic char. You can impress your friends with that the next round of beers you have or something. Again, they tend to, in rivers, they tend to live in slower pools. They tend to associate themselves with woody debris, except when you get these really big stream resident individuals, or anadromous individuals, they probably aren't going to find, you're probably not going to find them in the shallow areas of your rivers, probably going to find them in pools, really deep pools within the rivers, or actually in the ponds themselves. So Raccoon's Pond's a good one. In fact, I'd say I'd be willing to bet half of my checking account. My wife would get really mad if I bet all. But half of my checking account that at the very end of June, if you walk to the top of Raccoon's Pond and just around the corner and look across the river under the alders there, you should be able to see just a big school of fairly large individuals, some of which might be that size there, 5 or 6 pounds. So there's a lot of really big trout that use the river portion just above Raccoon's Pond to escape some of the warmer conditions out in the estuary. Some good habitat here in the Wheatley River. And wide diet from bugs to fish. So they eat just about anything that crosses their paths. Now I'm going to show you, because we've got a little bit of time. This will probably end just after this video here. Now some of you may have seen this. It's floated around a little bit online. This is taken in the Winter River. This is just showing you some of the spawning behaviors that brook trout have. So I took the GoPro camera and just put it on, attached it to a dive weight, and just set it down in the river bottom, and then walked away and just left it there for 2 hours. This is about a 6-pound male there. So this first section of the video shows the female, and she's trying to dig her red. So you can see that she's not really using her mouth. It's not very efficient for her to use her mouth like that sea lamprey does. You can see how broad the tail is there. It's very good for digging. There's a lot of muscle right down in the base of the tail there, which helps remove those larger stones. Start to see some other behaviors here in just a second. So fast forward this quivering again. So one of the things the male does, and tries to get her in the mood, so to speak, is he actually, you just saw it there, he kind of sidles up right next to her and quivers her body. You can see him quivering there. You can see his body tense up and shake a little bit. So he's just trying to stimulate her and get her excited and try and get her to start depositing some of her eggs. But of course, all these other guys are watching this happen, right? And so they'll try and shoot in there. If they see the female start to drop her eggs, they'll actually start to shoot in and try and steal fertilizations from the large male there. This is classic male posturing behavior. So they'll throw their dorsal fin up, their pectoral fins and pelvic fins, and they'll shoot them off to the side. They'll get very rigid under the water, and they start essentially circling themselves. So a little guy like that, we call those little sneaker minnows, and that's that behavior. He's trying to get and steal a fertilization from that large male there. But in that case, the female wasn't depositing any of her eggs. She's chasing off other females as well. She'll sometimes chase off other males if she doesn't want them in there. You almost nailed that little one there. I've actually seen them, the bigger dominant males, if there's a small male that's harassing him or the female, the large dominant male will actually go in and grab, the little one, T-bone it, and then grip it in its mouth and swim some distance off and then let go of that little male, and then it comes right back to the nest, and then you never see hide nor fin of that little one, and it leaves at that point. But you can see, I just sped up this video here, you can see just how energetically costly this is for that male. He's constantly moving. He gets no he's not able to rest at all. He's constantly fending off that bigger male there, a little male there, another male there. So this is quite an energetically costly time period for them, and they're not eating at this time either. So.
Did you look at when you put your camera there?
No, I had spent that fall. This was 2 falls ago. I spent about 30 hours just watching them. I had another bigger camera that I was set up next to a red, and then had a rope that I attached to the trigger on the camera, and just ran it up on shore. And I essentially just stood up on shore and looked down at the river, and anytime a fish swam in front of the camera, I just pull the cord and take a picture. So if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Sure.
Yes.
That video was with the river.
Yeah.
Prior to videos with the
Yeah.
sea lamprey and the eel, where were those taken?
So the eel was in Trachy Bay, and the sea lamprey was in Tay River, Brunswick. So sea lamprey, I probably should have mentioned that earlier. I don't know of any place on PEI that has sea lamprey. Has anyone else ever heard of them come in and actually spawn? Yeah, I've never talked to anyone that's ever seen them here. I'm not entirely sure why that is. I assume that it has something to do with just a lack of appropriate spawning habitat. You can see what that spawning habitat was like. Decent sized stone, clear water. We don't really have that here on PEI, so I assume it's some kind of limitation.
How did it just
Yeah.
come out so clear, get in the back of the water?
You have to get really close. Sometimes I'm this far away from them. Yeah, because if I try and shoot a picture of a fish from this distance, there's too much particulate between the camera and the fish. So the secret is to get as close as possible. Which, in the case of this photo and that photo, required me to sit pretty much motionless for hours in the river. I have to wear a dry suit, even with a dry suit. I can only usually be in the water for about 3 hours. It just gets so cold after a while. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
You might have said this, but when you're talking about the genetic disparity
With the salmon?
Yeah. Is there a theory on why that is?
That's a good question. I would have to go back to the paper and read that. I actually don't even think the paper touched on that. We just spent so much time talking about all of that, all of those other places as well. In my discussions with Scott Rollison at UPEI, who's also in my lab, I don't think he has a good idea either. But it may just have something to do with what used to be historically really good spawning habitat, and there's still quite good spawning habitat in that river. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah. I think Scott, one of the things that Scott, those are his hands there. One of the things that he's doing is he's taking an adipose fin clip, and they're stockpiling a bunch of those fin clips, and they're trying to do some genetics and further follow-up studies associated with that one. So maybe they'll be able to answer that in another 5 or 10 years or so. Any other questions? Sure.
So the group did some electric fishing
Yeah.
here on the river and found rainbow trout.
Yes.
For the first time.
Yeah.
Is that going to have a bad effect on the brook trout?
I don't think it's going to have a bad effect on the brook trout, because there's lots of rivers on PEI where they coexist just fine. In fact, they coexist okay with salmon too, and they were kind of thought as maybe being real bad competitors with salmon. The thing about PEI is there's no shortage of food, and in part that's because of the farming. We have lots of nutrients that are entering our rivers, whether that's good or bad. I'm not going to talk about that, but certainly one of the things that's brought is just a proliferation of food. So you're not going to see any issues associated with a depletion of food source for them. There's a bit of habitat separation with rainbow trout and brook trout. So rainbow trout will tend to like sort of riffly habitats with the faster flowing water, and brook trout again tend to kind of hang out in the pools and woody debris. You don't tend to find rainbows, in my experience, associated with a lot of like overhead cover and woody debris, but the brook trout definitely like it. So I think we have plenty of food for them, no problem there, and plenty of habitat. So I wouldn't expect them to be a big problem. Last year we actually also found rainbow trout for the first time in the Winter River too. So they're starting to, and then I think Scott found a rainbow trout somewhere on the northeast side of PEI up towards North Lake. I don't think it was North Lake Creek, but regardless, they're starting to spread out a bit. So, yeah.
They get you to talk about something you don't want to talk about.
Okay.
But
I did a lot of that yesterday, so it's his old hat now.
what kind of nutrients are going into the water that is food for fish?
So it's usually nitrogen that comes in as fertilizer, just naturally as we apply it to the farm fields, and there's enough just other human disturbance, other human activity that would bring some nitrogen into the water, and the nitrogen helps provide nitrogen and phosphorus. There would still be phosphorus in some of the commercial fertilizers. Phosphorus in freshwater is actually the limiting nutrient. So, in other words, you have just a little bit of phosphorus, and you can create an increase in plant growth, and all of that, in addition to the nitrogen, just makes living conditions for insects and the bottom of the food chain all that better. So it's not necessarily the nutrients themselves coming in that are the food sources, but it's providing all the conditions for the caddis flies and mayflies, and so there's been a study that's looked at like the percent agriculture within a watershed in relation to the abundance of macroinvertebrates and little insects. It just goes up. The more agriculture you have in a watershed, the more bugs you have. The more bugs you have, the more food you have for trout. So, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Any other questions? Yeah.
Organic matter in PEI soils, if that were to move into rivers and streams, is that also nutrients for?
Yeah, definitely. So you have lots of different macroinvertebrates that will shred that stuff. So you have your shredder group, and they will literally just start shredding the organic matter there, and then the little bits of material from so that would actually be another source of nutrients. So the organic matter that would come in off the farm fields, including at this time of year, and then again in the fall. So then the shredders, they shred bigger chunks up into small ones, and then you have a whole different group of insects that just uses the little bits of material, and they eat the little bits of material. And so there's several different groups of invertebrates that would eat those nutrients. Yeah. I'll just end with that structure there, that bypass, that runaround bypass channel at Rapids Pond. As just a little side note for you guys, since I'm speaking at the Winter River Improvement Group meeting. That structure had the highest passage efficiency for rainbow smelt. So that is the number of rainbow smelt that entered the bottom of that runaround bypass channel leading into the pond. The number that entered versus the number that passed was the highest percentage of any of the structures that I studied in my dissertation. So clearly, whatever was done there seems to be working. So
That's not a structure, that just happened.
yeah, I know. I have pictures of when it was built that the excavator just dug out. Yeah, but you know what? And that I actually use this structure, quote unquote, air quotes, as an example of what other watershed groups can do with not a whole lot of money. You know, Ducks Unlimited throws, and there's other watershed groups that will put in, you know, contracts and grants for $100,000, $250,000 to build these highly engineered structures. And you don't necessarily need a lot of investment to provide good fish passage. So in some cases, it may just be bring in an excavator for, I don't know, a couple $1,000 or whatever, $3,000, dig out a channel and call it a day. So not necessarily a big need for spending many, many hundreds of thousands of dollars.
I don't know how where you are, but that channel is about, that's strictly natural erosion.
Yeah, no, I know.
No machines.
Yeah, well, I have some pictures of when it was constructed. It looked like there was some excavator that had come in there and was digging it out. No, they just dredged it out. Oh, maybe that's what it was in there for. Okay.
That's the,
Yeah.
put some big rocks down there.
Yeah. Oh, maybe that's what it was doing. Was it bringing the rock?
Yeah.
Yeah. So even if you provide rock like that as resting pools, that's also really important as well. There's some other locations on PEI where similar looking things have been constructed. They were actually constructed. Like the Pisgah River is another example of something that looks like that, where they came in and used an excavator and dug out a few different pools and then placed some rock in to create those little step ladders, so to speak. And those structures tend to work really well. So, any other questions? Cool.
What would Rackers Pond, in your mind, be like if it was restored to what it was like 60 years ago, size-wise?
Size-wise? Well, 60 years ago, they used to have the old, is it a grist mill that was there?
Yeah, that was 70.
70 years
Well,
ago.
the mill was there, but I mean,
Yeah.
when the earth and dam was constructed.
Yeah, it's much higher there. Yeah. I mean, what do I think it should look like if we were to restore it to what it was pre-dam, or?
No. When the earth and dam was constructed in, I guess, in the 1960s.
I mean, the way it's constructed now, I think, provides a nice balance between riverine habitat and pool habitat. So, back then when the pond was a lot wider, the issue with some of these species that are migrating into freshwaters, especially rainbow smelt, and some of our students at UPI have found rainbow smelt way upstream, way up above the pond there. And one of my big concerns is when you get a big wide pond, they have a hard time finding their way upstream because they need that current to orient into. And so there might not look like there's a lot of current flowing through that pond right now, but there's clearly enough that's guiding those fish upstream. So I don't think if you can avoid it, go back to the way the old pond looked like, with the really wide, banks and extending way upstream. I think, as I said, right now you have a nice balance between deep water, where those sea run trout can come in and hold in the pond towards the top end of the pond before they go into the river itself, and then it's not so wide that it gets really still, and then can still be able to draw fish upstream. So I probably wouldn't touch it.
What about the depth of the pond itself?
I mean, I'm assuming that there's probably quite a bit of sediment that's built up. When was the last time it was dredged? Do you guys know? Was it ever dredged?
10 years ago?
10 years ago?
No, it's a little more than that. Less than 15.
Yeah, the Wheatley River watershed has a fair amount of agriculture in it. Without going out there with a depth sounder and kind of taking a profile of the pond, it'd be hard to. Do you guys ever do that? Is there any data?
We did it last year.
Is there anything over time though to see how that changes?
Just twice, so I think it was 10 feet, and then
That's what we call it.
Yeah.
5 years later, it's 5 feet.
10 feet at the deepest, and then 5 feet later, half that.
Yeah.
5 years later.
So that's what
That's a lot. Yeah, that's a lot of sediment that's going in there. 5 feet at the deepest, I'd say you're probably pushing it in terms of the number of trout that move in there. You can get some saturated conditions. Now they can just go upstream if they can't hold very long within the pools at the top, within the bigger pools at the top of the pond. But yeah, you guys might want to start thinking about the possibility of it. But then what do you do with the sediment? Where do you put the sediment?
More questions?
Yeah.
Well, that's a bigger issue. But the thing is, the bigger issue is, if a dredging never comes up again, to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
In 10 years.
Yeah.
And that's the issue.
Now, Fred Chevry built that crazy sediment cannon thing. Did you guys see that last year? He has this dredger that they were using it relatively shallow in the estuaries, but you might be able to retrofit it. Basically, it's just a generator with a tube that goes to the bottom, sucks it out, and then has a high pressure thing nozzle that shoots the sediment out. And so you might be able to shoot it out, but I don't know if you put that thing in the middle of the pond, would you be able to shoot the sediment out onto land, or does it just end up into the water there? I don't know. What's that? Yeah, like so.
Listen, Sean,
Yeah.
great, thank you. I'd like to thank Sean again. Here's a gift. We had Sean in 2 years ago, and I was amazed by his presentation 2 years ago, and I was really excited we could get him again this year. And he did well for us. I find the whole thing very interesting. You can go to his photography website for a lot of great viewings, and I'd just like to thank Dr. Sean Landsman for the presentation.